I just thought I'll give you a sense. I mean, before you read the book, what is this book all about? What am I trying to say? And why? And why I think it's important today. Um, what is its real meaning, and why is it important to know the meaning? Essentially, I feel that populism is used traditionally over the past 100 years and more to describe many politicians in India, but it's not clear. At least it's not been clear so far. At least not explicitly if they actually share a common meaning. In many ways, many people have used the word from Periyar, Gandhi, all the way to today's politicians to label politicians as populists, but it's not clear what they mean when they actually say this. And because of the rise of many populists in other parts of the world, we also have, uh, you know, scholars trying to sort of integrate the Indian case along with others, with the other literature from other parts of the world. But fundamentally, at least in the West, populism is associated with a people centric approach. It's driven by virtuous people against a certain elite. And therefore, it hinges and its core property is something called popular sovereignty. But I argue in the book that popular sovereignty in India is constitutive of India's democracy, but it's not the same. Our genealogy and its history with popular sovereignty, certainly not something that we share with Western history. There's also this thing that populism is a threat in many countries. It's anti-democratic, almost authoritarian, um, and populism is equated with a radical right version of populist figures. But I argue that populism is not an anomaly; it's certainly baked into our democratic fabric from a long time. Irrespective, over the past several decades, we usually have many populists, emerging at the state level. They're not as visible, but they certainly do emerge once in a while. So while it's convenient and plausible to fit into available theory, I think it sort of, you know, simplifies what is a very rich democratic history, very diverse democratic history of India, both in the politics of the nation and the politics within its states. I actually argue that populism is not a deviant version of democracy like you find in the West. It's in fact, I argue, something which is, I think, a bit provocative, where I say liberal Democrats tend to accommodate and unite, stitch together coalitions. But actually, populists, on the other hand, they draw boundaries. They parse people and they divide people, and they think they're doing so for the greater common good. Both want to do it for the greater common good. Liberal Democrats tend to unite, populists tend to divide. It's a construction. So it's populism is a construction, by which I mean it's something which is which is, let's say, a condition that we're used to, an acceptable way of living, but a populist articulates it as a condition, as an unacceptable way of living, and it draws a boundary, or she draws a boundary against people who they think they should be blamed, and it leaves open a capacious rolling invitation to whoever wants to join the group. So the conventional idea of a populist would be typically that there are people who are very resentful. Out of them emerges a person. This person represents the people, and they fight against the elite. But I think the argument, at least from my book, is actually there's people are resentful, but there's a person who taps into that resentment, who's able to articulate that resentment, and is able to hold someone accountable, and he's open to whoever wants to join him to fight against that outgroup. Right? When I say it like this, it always sounds very negative, but the same logic of populism, of dividing people, can also be a force for the good. Um, in other words, it can articulate experiences that people are just used to as acceptable conditions, but they turn it and they problematize that particular condition. It could be against colonialism, it can be against inequality, it can be against um, very elite parties or closed party systems, and they feel that these are problems and that requires a particular public intervention. And I won't mention cases and details, but there are cases and details for each of these instances, even in Indian politics today. I think the big story is essentially that when we look at populists, we tend to describe them for who, or we see them for who they are, or more importantly, who we think they are. But this book tries to understand populism in terms of what they actually do, and who they are depends on where you stand on the democratic divide. Right? So, for me, populists divide for the greater common good. They are who they are depending on where we stand. So the focus is more on what they do, which is to divide. This is just the last part. I use the word why logic. And this is the second big story. It's a parallel story running with the idea of populism, which is why have I used the logic? Because this is for a more technical audience, this is a methodological intervention. Most of us who do research either use a certain qualitative or use text or use narrative, which has a grammatical logic to it, or they use statistics or data, which is essentially a probabilistic logic. And very few have used what is called a Boolean logic or a configurational logic, which is another form of logic. And I use this logic. That's why the word logic in the title. And I use this because I try to see patterns using set theory. So if you notice, there's a column drawn. That was actually I didn't know how to draw it, so I asked my daughter to draw it for me. And we put it on the book. But it's essentially a pattern that follows rules, right? You look at rules and then you identify patterns from the title. And the logic is essentially something that most people who are from a technical background, like a technological, people who've done BTech or who've done electrical engineering and so on would know this. But frankly, in the social sciences, I haven't seen any book that looks at Boolean logic in the context of making or constructing concepts in Indian social science. And what we use, you can't see it here, but there's essentially a truth table. And much like, so this is just a methodological thing that I'm trying to say. So for those who are interested in building concepts, are interested in constructing concepts, and have a technical background, they would also find this book particularly useful, especially if you come from an engineering background. And you create this particular visual, which is a Venn diagram, which describes essentially the argument. I'm not going to get into further detail, but that's essentially what this book is about, right? Why is it important? Why now? And so on. Before I close, I just want to thank, a few minutes just to thank a few people who are. This book has taken me many years to write, almost a decade, if not more. And I want to place on record my gratitude to the Azim Premji Foundation, who has institutionally supported this for all the years that I've been through. And I'm thankful for the National Law School and the Bangalore International Center for hosting this. I also want to thank my family, who's taken a long toll, and I just want to thank them for being here and supporting me in this project. So that's it. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to be in Bangalore International Center. I've been coming here since 2005 when it was in its older abode, and now, of course, it's been here for quite some years. So I've been also asked to present the argument of the book. The assumption here is that the reader or close reader sometimes summarizes the argument better than the author. It's a very standard intellectual problem in the scholarly world. So, and also novelists say that again and again. So in that spirit, first we should right away note that this is the first book on the entire array of populisms in India, and note the term populisms there. That's also in the title of the book, in the title of this event. And earlier works concentrated on a single case or a region. Naren Subramaniam's book on Tamil Nadu, Dravidian populism, Tamil Nadu, is very well known. Dipankar Gupta wrote on Shiv Sena, published in 82, 83. He didn't use the term populism, though, when he wrote about the Shiv Sena. Later on, he was more willing to use the term. But populism in India has historically been associated with left-wing fiscal handouts. The idea that there could be right-wing populism of the Shiv Sena kind and others, as we'll come in a moment, was that hadn't entered intellectual consciousness. And it was in any case, well known in It came to be well known in the world outside the United States and Europe in recent times. So, so I'll give you my understanding what the core of um, Krishna's argument is, Iyengar's argument. In what ways is the argument distinctive? And for that, I'll have to set it against the background of existing theories and approaches. And then I'll have two lingering questions, maybe one. One is very important there out of two. Why is Nitish Kumar not a populist is perhaps an interesting thing to discuss, but that's not really the conceptually the most important point here. So here are the key features of Krishna's argument. So as he said, some of this he said, but not all of it, he said. Populism is baked into the political fabric of India, his language. At the national level, Indira Gandhi, Narendra Modi, it takes the form of illiberal democracy, either from the left or from the right. At the subnational level, Dravidianism in Tamil Nadu, NTR in Andhra, Mamata Banerjee's Bengal, Kejriwal's Delhi, it generally does not take an illiberal form, though in Maharashtra it certainly did under Bal Thackeray. Mumbai, to be more precise. At the national level, the terms left wing populism of Indira Gandhi or right wing populism of Narendra Modi make sense. Subnational populisms defy the left right categorization. That is actually one of the more original, of several original arguments. This is the more original argument of this book. Indian populists, you heard, do not invoke populist sovereignty or the people versus the elite as the founding idea of populism. I'll say a bit more on this. This idea is also new. They first construct the outgroup, the enemy, the Brahmin, the Muslim, the Delhi rulers against, let's say, Hyderabad, against NTR, Mrs. Gandhi against NTR, using president's rule. Han Market gang, corrupt elite. So the enemy or the outgroup is first constructed, and then populists formulate the idea of the people by, this is a lovely sentence he's used, he used it here as well, by leaving open a capacious rolling invitation to whoever wants to join against the outgroup. Indian populism typically does not begin with latent or explicit mass attitudes. The argument is very clear. It begins with populist leadership, which engages in antagonistic boundary setting. Populist leaders, in other words, are a necessary condition for Indian populism. Boundary setting and invocations to the people should be viewed as sufficient conditions. That is to say, no populist leaders, no populism. Is basically it's a necessary condition. They tend to succeed. He doesn't want to make a causal argument, so this is he has a configurative analysis in mind, and I think we shouldn't technically discuss it any further. It'll take us away from the substantive issues. The methodology is very novel and very attractive, but that's for an academic audience and a PhD seminar. For here, I think we should be concentrating on substance. Populist leaders tend to succeed when the masses are anxious about the future, and he said that here in his 7-8 minutes, when the lived experience of a substantial section of the masses begins to correspond with what leaders describe as key problems and possible solutions. The leaders pick up something in the lived experience of the masses. Masses are probably latent, but not explicitly articulated until the leaders do that. Liberal Democrats pursue the path of, you heard that too, this is a central theme in the book, pursue the path of accommodate and unite, but populists parse and divide. However, the methods may be different, but both seek greater common good. Even the parsing and dividing is aimed at a greater common good. There is a counterintuitive point there. We can discuss it later. So, in what ways is the argument distinctive? Methodologically, you've heard Boolean logic. Let's not spend more time on that. Substantively, there have been two main approaches to populism. I guest edited a special issue of our journal, which is headquartered at the Watson School at Brown. So all of this was, we went through all of this systematically. There were two main approaches, the ideational approach and the strategic approach. And the strategic approach came first chronologically. And for the strategic approach, populism is simply a strategy of leaders for winning power through a direct, unmediated, and intense arousal of mass sentiment. Ideational content is virtually irrelevant in that strategic approach. And it works well, especially in conditions of economic distress or in moments of perceived high threats to the ethnic makeup, ethnic, racial, religious makeup of a society. And Kurt Wayland is perhaps the leading scholar in this idiom. And Latin America is where this has been tried out. This idea was born and discussed at length. For the ideational approach, dominant these days, populism is thin-centered ideology. This is very important. Not a full-blown ideology like liberalism, conservatism, socialism. And it's rooted in the idea of popular will or popular sovereignty. Some they are used interchangeably. It's rampantly anti-elitist, views the masses as virtuous and the elites as immoral and corrupt. Hence the argument that populism has a Manichaean ethic. This is a good versus evil, the fight between good versus evil. And it equates democracy with elections and referenda, for they represent popular will. And the non-elected, this he didn't lay it out for you, but it appears in the book, and it appears certainly in the ideational approach. The non-elected institutions of oversight, courts, election commissions, the press, intelligence agencies, civil society, central banks, which normally constrain democratic governments between elections, the 4 years between elections, 5 years between elections, they must follow electoral verdicts or must subscribe to the primacy of electoral primacy, not their institutionally assigned autonomous roles. Being unelected, the autonomy of such institutions should be curbed, even crushed. Now, and that's Cas Mudda is perhaps the leading advocate of the ideational approach. Now, what are Krishna's points of departure? Anti-elitism is not the core of Indian populism, he's arguing. This is, for the first time, I think, this argument has been made. It can be a theme, a significant theme, to be sure, but the core is the construction of an outgroup. The outgroup can be an elite group, Brahmins in Madras, Han Market gang in Delhi, but it can also be an underprivileged minority, Muslims, or an inchoate but ethnically different group, Northeastern migrants in Bangalore, UP migrants in Mumbai. Popular sovereignty is also not the core of Indian populisms. Larger aim is greater common good rather than realization of popular sovereignty, even if this strategy is sparse and split. Populist leaders come first, populism comes next. Mass attitudes, even if populists are at best latent, no populist leaders, as I said earlier, no populism. These are the points of departure. Here is a question for all of us to ponder and Krishna to ponder even more seriously. First of all, this is the best account thus far of populism in India. But is it the case that Krishna is being over generous to subnational populists? Here is a quote from page 151. Illiberal populists at the national level, Narendra Modi, Indira Gandhi, and liberal populists at the subnational level. Here is my question. Can populism be liberal at all? Liberalism not only means inclusion, especially of minorities, and especially after 1945, after the horrors of the Second World War in Europe, but it also requires commitment to freedom of expression, freedom of association, meaning civil society, and freedom of religious practice. It also means accepting the idea of limited government, that original John Stuart Mill idea that liberalism at the institutional level means limited government. limited by the constitution, limited by laws, and some would add, where constitutions don't exist, widely accepted, historically anchored traditions and norms. So here is my question to our panel, and especially to Krishna. Do any subnational populists meet this description? Can we use the term liberal populist at all? Isn't that a contradiction in terms? And isn't the term market populism a contradiction in terms in a post-ISI globalization era? ISI, when import substituting industrialization, was the economic model that the global south followed roughly 1950 to 1980. Then the term market populism made sense because the state had and the bureaucracy had so much control of the production process of the economy that whether or not planned industrialization and import substitution was helping the masses became roughly irrelevant, and opening up the market and liberalization ended up getting masses into the. But once globalization is all set and it has reached the point that it did by 2008 and what we've been watching, can markets be populist? And I have an example in mind, but I think on the whole, this term in the globalization era and that era is ending now just does not make sense. It's a contradiction in terms. So let me leave it here, and once again thank Krishna for giving us such a remarkably comprehensive, theoretically anchored, methodologically astute account of India's various populisms. Thank you.
Dr. Krishnaswamy, Dr. Varshney, Dr. Ayyangar, and distinguished friends and colleagues. It's at one level very unfair to ask me to speak after someone like Professor Varshney, who spent a lifetime studying Indian politics as a scholar. I am a student of history, largely environmental history. I was told long ago that wildlife includes politics. And in today's world, I think you can be forgiven for thinking it does. I have, of course, been an observer of Indian politics, both as a journalist and commentator sometime. But what I'm going to do is slightly different, which is to try and place this book in its historical context. I was very struck by the presentation because I do feel that it managed to give us what in Hindi is called the sar and what in Hindustani classical is called the ras, the gist of the book so beautifully. Populism, he said, is structured into the democratic fabric of politics in India. And in a sense, if one thinks of the freedom struggle and the iconic figure of Mahatma Gandhi in the Salt Satyagraha, you think of two other demands that were voiced, which we often forget: the abolition of Chaukidari tax and the halving of land revenue. And please note, it's land revenue, not rent. So it's very careful that it is against the British, not against the rent-receiving zamindars. The Chaukidari tax, of course, is levied across the villages, so it unifies all the villagers. Nobody quite wants to pay for a Chaukidar who has a staff and looks over you and is actually the eyes and ears of government. I do think that Professor Varshney did say something of enormous importance. I kept wondering what ISI refers to. And, inter-services intelligence is one obvious answer. There may be lots of others, Indian Standards Institute. But in one sense, I think what he said is especially significant. Where the early years of independence was the era of Congress dominance, and that ended actually in 84 or 89. Depends where you put the marker. The last time Congress secured a majority on its own. And in 89, of course, it ceased to be the fulcrum of Indian politics. Since then, Indian politics has been searching for a fulcrum. Whether it found that in 2014 or not, I leave it to you and the future to judge. But when one looks at the pulse and pressures of politics, I'm very struck that in this book, populism is very carefully refined. There are different layers, there are different kinds of leaders, there are different distinctions. But I think they're somewhat different from what a student of history might make. And I think this is a it's not only a methodological divide, it's also a divide of how one approaches complex social reality. So the Dravidian movement for many of my discipline would be a form of social radicalism, which was quite comprehensive because it took up cultural, social, political transfer with varying degrees of success. It's been around for over 100 years. It's been in power since 1967. Its probably most significant accomplishment is that no All India party actually can conceive of coming to power in Tamil Nadu. But social radicalism in northern India, and I'm struck by the fact he's talked of Bihar, is actually about the capture of political power. And I'm struck by the fact that neither of proponents of it, they were brothers in arms, then they parted, then they came together and they parted again. I refer of course Nitish Kumar and Lalu. We have not seen far-reaching social transformation, education, in terms of opening of opportunities of employment, the kind of churning that has happened not only in Tamil Nadu, but also in large parts of Peninsular India, Maharashtra and the other southern. And here there's a similarity actually of Bihar with West Bengal. And one is tempted to ask whether the difference actually is between areas under the permanent settlement, where the economy settles into a sort of low equilibrium, irrespective of who's in charge. Remember, these are states which had long spells of Congress and then went into non-Congress, the left front, and then Mamtadi, who's a regional Congress, the Congress, and then various forms of the Lohi Act, which is how I see both Lalu and in this low equilibrium economics, the us versus them politics, of course, matters. My sense is that with C.N. Annadurai is coming to power, in fact, the election of 67 is very significant because he distances the DMK from the DK, this anti-Brahmin rhetoric. He actually explicitly speaks of, Voru Devam, Voru Kulam, Voru Irakam, which effectively roughly translates into one God, one people, one nation. And I think that Tamil regional nationalism is distinctive also in that it frames itself not only in anti-center discourse, but in terms of political power and fiscal federalism. And this continues under the ADMK. One of the people who formed the Southern Conclave of Chief Ministers was M.G. Ramachandran. I'm very struck, of course, in the reference to freebies, which is the commonly used term. I think Professor Varshney quite rightly said welfare handouts, which is a much better term. And so many Indian political leaders have referred to it. But, look at something which has vanished from our politics. The person who spoke, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, right from 1967, 67 election, which was a disaster for the Congress. For the first time, you had a leader saying that I have a family, all of you have families, but I have to think about all the families. मुझे सब परिवारों का ख्याल रखना पड़ता है. This is the first time she invokes the notion of the family and herself. And remember, it's a very, very careful play on emotion. She's a woman. She's alone, taking care of her two sons. And she's heading a beleaguered party. It is a beleaguered party. It's very different from Mahatma Gandhi as father of the nation. He never fought an election. And I was very struck by this fact that I wrote it down. It's very interesting. She always spoke of हम जो पिछड़े हैं, जो गरीब हैं उनके लिए. We're fighting for the poor and the backward. Not their empowerment, but herself as the person who will provide and be this protective umbrella. And here there's a striking comparison. In 67, 68, Congress is fighting, after two droughts, upwelling of radicalism, particularly in Eastern India, the onslaught of all the anti-Congress forces coming together. And in a sense, I think that there is a similarity with Modi. You see, when Mr. Modi gets elected as the prime ministerial candidate, or chosen as the prime ministerial candidate of BJP, the Goa convention of the party, the meeting of the National Executive Council, he said that he did not believe in the Congress way of running the economy. And those who are economic liberals were delighted. All the economic papers wrote delightedly about what he said. He said he believed in government which governs the least. And that the way the Congress practiced politics was to distribute public goods. And the Economist wrote a very glowing editorial in which they estimated that if India had the per capita income of Gujarat, it would be at the level of Spain. This is in the campaign. just pre-campaign 2013-14. It was a long campaign. Immediately after that, effectively, is in campaign mode. An outstanding campaigner. No one will doubt that. Some people even say he's permanently on campaign, which is not only true of Bill Clinton, it's true about Donald Trump. The transformation of BJP and NDA comes after the 2015, late 2015, there are two major electoral reverses. And one, interestingly, is the Aam Aadmi Party's huge victory in Delhi, which is a traditional Jansangh bastion. It's been a bastion. 15 years Congress has ruled it. There's been a minority party of AAP, and this time AAP wins a huge majority, virtually all the seats. BJP is wiped out. It's a very strong second party. It remains the number one party in most Lok Sabha elections in the post-89 era in Delhi, but it loses. More importantly, this social coalition, which is anti-cultural nationalism, is reconstituted by a remarkable combination of Nitish and Lalu, in which, if you study, Nitish campaigned mainly along the main road and talked about development, while Lalu went to the interior and talked about, unifying against those who were formerly in power. So this is something which I think we should keep in mind. Those whom we think of as populists are capable of tactical transformation. Yesterday's liberalizer becomes today's populist. Today's populist can unify with a developmentalist and come apart again. And we do know that in 2015, it's a historic victory of this alliance. And then the coalition came apart. And BJP's strength in North India is that it has managed to take Bihar. I look at Bihar and the victories in the Lok Sabha elections in Bihar is far more significant than UP, because they've never managed actually to take Bihar. Whether they will or not is a different question. There is a very interesting question of what about Maharashtra and Gujarat? And the Shiv Sena here is a very different party. The Shiv Sena began, after all, with roots in the Samyukta Maharashtra movement. Madras state has a long history. Maharashtra does not. Maharashtra is constituted as a result of a movement. Similarly, there is a movement to create a unified state of Gujarat. These are under multiple jurisdictions in the British era and in the early years of independent India. And the notion of the Marathi Asmita lays the ground for the notion of the Maratha Manus of Mumbai, who's under threat, both from communists and the outsider. And here I think this book does a remarkable job. It shows us, the non-Maharashtrian, this threat of them overcrowding and the capture of jobs. But the Shiv Sena remains extremely vulnerable for a very interesting reason. As you know, the name Shiv Sena was originally, there were other names. It was at the suggestion of one of the very important business tycoons, you can find out who supported them, that they named it after Shivaji. And Shivaji is a fascinating figure. He's revered by all Maharashtrians of all communities, all castes, all classes. Each reads him in a very different way. He was largely read as a Maratha figure. They read him as a Marathi figure. But the Marathi figure is also an icon of Hindu cultural nationalism. And it's fascinating that the Shiv Sena's first success, 1990, when they break through, BJP does even better than them. The strike rate is better. 1995, when they form a government, BJP strike rate is better. And eventually, the BJP overwhelms the Sena. Sena breaks up into many bits, and the BJP effectively takes control of Maharashtra. So is certain type of regionalism, which uses the same cultural icons as all India nationalism, in this case cultural nationalism, more vulnerable. So vulnerable that it's been overwhelmed. Gujarat, interestingly, is a parallel, because a lot of the ground for the rise of BJP is laid in the 80s and the early 90s. In the 80s, in the movement against reservation for backward classes and the removal of Solanki from power, but much more so in the 90s, in the vision of Naya Gujarat, which is chalked out by Chimanbhai Patel, and the very important mobilization pro the Narmada Dam. And I think the pro-Narmada Dam agitation is as important as the anti-Narmada Dam agitation, because it was seen widely in Gujarat as the defense of Gujarati Asmita, a thirsty Gujarat wanting water. Now, whether it did not get the water, we can debate it. But I think it's very critical that this Gujarati Asmita blends into Hindu cultural nationalism. And when the judgment comes on the Sardar Sarovar Dam 2001, Mr. Narendra Modi is the chief minister. They hold a very important rally in which Advani hails them, and so on. So there's a very interesting question about the illiberalism of the national level. One thing I would agree with Professor Varshney, and I would like to provoke the authors. The state leaders can be as illiberal as the national. NTR, in his first reign in power, there were a lot of anti-Dalit atrocities. That's one reason he lost in 89 and his national ambitions crumbled. In his later spell in power, he unleashed what are called the Green Hounds, which was the sort of prototype for the larger operations in Adivasi tracts under the UPA government and the NDA. Similarly, I don't think the word liberal would be used to describe the way in which educational institutions have been handled under Trinamool Congress in West Bengal. They are remarkably similar to the way the left front organized. So I can multiply these examples. In fact, there is a question which stares us in the face institutionally. To a large extent, the illiberality of the present government of NDA is traced by many to the RSS, BJP, or the Jansa. That may be true. But is it also because the Prime Minister and Home Minister both have held these posts at the state level? And those who have held these posts at the state level tend to approach things somewhat differently from those who have come through national politics. We're too close to make a judgment, but we should think about it. So what are the two things I find most fascinating about this book? One is that liberal democracy itself presumes that that form of democracy is liberal to all. Whereas, in reality, liberal democracy was constituted historically in the post-45 as explicitly anti-communist and anti-socialist. It's true, it left room for left-wing parties in Western Europe, but they were part of the US-led order. In the Indian case, the Brazilian case, the South African case, the only liberal democratic party actually since independence was Swatantra. And it did do well in the 67 election, but it perished. So when there is such a large propertyless population, when there is such a large number of people who are at the lower end of the scale and underprivileged, is it a viable democratic enterprise? History will judge. And at one level, Narendra Modi struggled and struggles with this question, as the Congress struggled with the question. And populism is one response to this. Where I think I would agree with both Professor Varshney and the author, and this is something of enormous and it is a worrying, that in the early years, 60s, 70s, 50s, the expansion of education opportunity was seen as vital, but along with it, there was the idea of an equal society through redistribution of productive assets, such as land and property, or taxation for redistribution. Now, this fitted very well in the notion of state as the driver of investment. And of course, post-91, we don't see the state as the driver of investment. The roots of this lay earlier. Srinath Raghavan's new book, Indira Gandhi and Her Impact, shows that already by the 72, she's moving away from the socialist turn of the 69 to 71. And the new work by Engerman, Apostles of Development, shows something everybody in this room knows, that Dr. Manmohan Singh all along inside government in his own quiet reflective way was advocating decontrol. But in the post-91 world, these welfare handouts, as they are sometimes called, are very critical for a large mass of people. So one looks at, say, pulses, not grain, but pulses. They're very critical for protein. But why is there not so much emphasis on job creation or on creation of more productive assets, which will actually raise incomes? There is no clear answer to this. And when you have parties with a short term of 5 years and a lifespan probably of governments of 5 years, political leaders at most of 10 years, it's extraordinary and remarkable that someone should win 3 elections in a row. And in a history of democracy, only 2 people have, and only 3 have won elections 3 times. So, is populism one of the issues structured into our politics in the way it has been experienced in India since 1952? Because this is a unique experience. So I don't know. And I think the remarkable thing about this book is it raises a lot of questions. It gives us very deep insight. And it's fascinating the amount of detail it has. I mean, it's always wonderful to see someone who has fully engaged with political theory, statistical methods. I think it's a sign of your humility and grace that you gave your daughter credit for that diagram. I'm sure you told her what you wanted to represent. And I think that this attention to detail is especially important because India is a country full of, all the phenomena are mutually contradictory. It's a large, complex country. And I think this plethora of leaders you have read about, study, this complexity of so many states. One of the great things about someone who zooms in on one state is they gave us a lot of depth on that place, but you're left wanting more. How does it fit the larger picture? And I think this is a remarkable book. Gives us the larger picture, the intermediate picture, and it also gives us the micro detail. So I think this book will stand the test of time, and it's a great privilege to be here. And thank you for sparing.
So thanks, Professor Varshney and Professor Rangarajan for getting us started. We have till 7 o'clock this evening. Patient audience, we are assuming. And I'll try and split this in this way, that I'll just do 2 rounds with the panel and then open it up to audience questions. So let me start almost where Mahesh left us, which is about the styles and the genres of political analysis that we have grown accustomed to in India. Because for me, this book is important because it makes a significant departure in the way it does political analysis. I think this is very important to emphasize and mention. I take Professor Varshney's comment that we don't want to get into a detailed discussion of a set theory or a sort of a quantitative comparative analysis conversation. I take that to be the subject of another kind of discussion. But what we're used to in India as political analysis or political theory tends to tilt first towards political history as a subgenre, tends to tilt towards a kind of quantitative political science that's interested in elections, so a sort of elections-focused analysis. And then we have a few scholars who do something different. Professor Varshney is one of them, bringing a kind of empiricism as well as a rigorous theoretical framing to questions. So I think this book for me marks out that kind of method in a very ambitious scale. So I just want to just draw the panel out on this question of approach. How do we do politics analysis in just a historical sense? Because even if we took Rajni Kothari as one point of departure, I sense that we're getting a different kind in the last 5 years, last decade, a different kind of political analysis that's emerging and growing. And to me, it's a welcome trend. But let me open it out. I'll go to Krishna last since he's labored the most on this. Would you like to start, Ashu?
It's true that social science, political science, but not only political science, social science in general, two approaches, two analytic approaches have dominated. One is cause and effect analysis. It could be handled quantitatively, it could be handled qualitatively through process tracing, etc. Or correlational analysis, which is not cause and effect, but what is connected to what, which outcome is connected to, without making a very strong causal claim, what kinds of background factors. And the points that Krishna is making is that there is something called configurative analysis, and set theory is using, where basically one set is a congeries of elements that constitute that set. Another set could have some of those, but some other elements. And there could be some, as in a Venn diagram, some commonalities, but the way the elements are arranged in set 1, set 2, and set 3 make those sets very distinctive. And that kind of approach he cites James Mahoney for that, and one of the oldest colleague of James Mahoney is present in the room, but while Mahoney is brilliant, and all of us have known that, it's not clear that he's been able to shape social science analysis enter the mainstream. He's a brilliant man who's not reshaped the mainstream, and so you're picking up something, bringing something from just outside the mainstream into the analysis of a very mainstream political phenomenon called populism, and I've truly admired what you've done with it.
Mahesh?
No, I think there was a tradition set by people like Myron Weiner and Professor Rajni Kothari, and Professor Varshney definitely is an exception. But there was a tendency, certainly from late 80s, 90s on, to concentrate either on electoral analysis. And we have some of the very fine political theorists in India, theories of political ideology. Also, people who have studied institutions. To me, I mean, what strikes me is the absence of history of contemporary India. Largely, we are still reliant on excellent journalistic accounts, very good ones. Biographies like the one on Deve Gowda, for example, written by a very distinguished journalist here, Sukata, and Srinivasa Raju, Vasanthi on and Paneer Selvan on Karnanidhi. There are others, but there are very interesting sociological studies on contemporary India, but historians have largely ignored it, and that's unfortunate. I think historians could have contributed to the study of process and context, and also to look at the longer range transformations. So for me, what is very striking in this book, for instance, is that these figures like Mamta Banerjee and Nitish Lalu are in the permanent settlement area, whereas Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu are from Rayatwadi areas. Rayatwadi areas, the reach of state was always better. The delivery of government is better because its information base is better. You look at something very simple like the health system, the ability to deliver a vaccine, the ability to deliver better maternity services. And these have been drawn upon by political leaders. That's not, Jayalalitha springs to mind, the Amma clinics, the Amma canteens. And very important, by the way, since I have talked to a lot of journalists who've used them, women journalists, the Amma toilets, they said they were cleaner than those in five-star hotels. And at least 2-3 have come and said this to me. And they are not admirers of her. Now, it's very difficult to set these up in certain parts of India where government actually doesn't have the capacity. So why is this so? And I think this is very important. And one of the positive and very powerful features of this book is that it keeps reminding us that in a situation where day-to-day life is very difficult, the leader is the deliverer. Now, they are not looking at these ideal types and big comparisons. They're not looking at Tamil Nadu versus Bihar and Maharashtra versus West Bengal. That's not important to a voter on the ground. They're looking at day-to-day life. And in that situation, this leader looks like the answer. They give them a chance. What's wrong with giving someone a chance? Sometimes they give them a couple of chances, and most important, they can throw them out. And they do with a bang. When they go, they just it's all over. That shows an incredibly high level of discontent with the style of leadership also. We should raise this as a question. Why is this so prominent that leaders rise and then vanish? They disappear. It's not peculiar to India.
Yeah. Krishna?
How much time?
Yeah, let's continue.
So I'll just give 2-3 responses, but before I give responses, I want to thank Professor Varshney and Professor Rangarajan. Both of you have played a huge role in my life. I mean, Professor Varshney actually pivoted me when we were writing this paper along with Siddharth. He actually said, Krishna, you think visually. And that was the first time someone had actually told me that. And he said, someone who thinks visually is Amartya Sen in one of his early works. And obviously, who doesn't want to be like Amartya Sen? So, right. So I started my work, journey in set theory with that. So I owe him a lot because he inspired me actually to write the book. And Professor Rangarajan is a person I've been watching on TV. You know, all of us got inspired by politics since the 1990s. And I've always wanted to be a person who knew politics as deeply and as thoroughly as he did. And he still amazes me by the depth and gravity of his knowledge associated with politics. Thank you both. So, Ashu, can a subnational be a liberal populist, or is there something called liberal populist? My response is I'm going to take one step back. Fair enough, I do think populists are mostly democratic than liberal. But I also feel that there's a bigger question, and in that bigger question, does populism even fit in as a label is a question that I'm not very clear about. And the bigger question is, I think we are seeing the unhinging of liberalism and democracy. What we're seeing is a certain democratic backlash against liberals. We can fit in populists along with Democrats. Maybe you can fit in populists along with liberals, those who support the rights of the disenfranchised, especially in Latin America. But the bigger problem is if liberalism and democracy unhinge or they come apart, what can you explain as a populist leader that will emerge in this chasm is a question that I'm not answering in this book. But it's a question that I think needs answering. Whether such people who emerge within this chasm through this should be called populists. I know I've published the book and so on, but I think the label is a placeholder for something much more problematic. We don't have a good label for this particular person who is immensely popular because he feeds and he feeds off a resentment that is very genuine. Whether we should call it a populist, I'm using this right now as a placeholder. So to answer your question, I don't have an answer, but I really want your thoughts about whether you do find that liberalism and democracy, something that we've got so used and cherished over and we've nurtured over the past 100 years, is actually coming unhinged because there's a democratic backlash against liberalism. And Professor Rangarajan, Mahesh, you've taken me back. The depth to which I can compare, the permanent settlement states and you immediately made me think about, the Rameshwar Rao and Frankel comparative politics book, which is where all of us learned our lessons about subnational comparative politics. I didn't go to that depth, to be very honest. I didn't look at the social movements that were underpinning these kinds of leaders. I was more narrowly focused into understanding what is this leader a case of. Nitish Kumar is there in the book, but he does not acquire the kind of traction as a populist. And I think I also tried, and there is no reason to think that a populist can be a non-populist tomorrow or someone else. And that's the sort of space that I'm trying to give myself. And I hope further research will throw up more and more populists, and we'll develop this argument further. That's my response so far.
So Krishna stole my second question. So I thought that we would start with the question of methods and genres of political analysis. But you've already gone to the second question. So I'll just follow you there. And I thought that Ashu asked that question squarely. Is there a version of a liberal populism, whether that be at the subnational or national level? And I think that in your response, Krishna, you took us to the idea that we need to actually play three concepts at the same time. There's liberalism, there's democracy, and there's populism. And the way you organize the three concepts and their relationship to each other might determine part of the answer. But we also want to get traction on the substance of politics, as you put it, the substantive part of what we can explain and understand about politics. So I'll say that, and I'll go back and I'm going to suggest to Ashu, since Krishna didn't, that the subnational liberal populist doesn't move in the directions in which you suggested that populists might threaten, the rights regimes. I take Mahesh's caution that on occasion, universities in West Bengal don't look good, and clearly you can't give a some kind of other explanation for this, except to say it is what it is. It is the exercise of a party state controlling university academic spaces. This is true. So, having said that, I think there's a difference between the sort of the axes of particular freedoms and a sort of the constellation of all freedoms, right? So the liberal populist, in that sense, to the extent that that Krishna pushes in that direction at the subnational level, they trade on a different metric, right? Which is the other side of liberalism, that John Stuart Mill wrote about, and compellingly, which is not a very popular form in the European or in the American version of liberal democracy, which is to talk about liberal essentials. So they are liberal populists, but they focus not on the negative freedoms side of the liberal calculation, but on the positive liberal essentials. So they are working off a liberal formulation. It's just not the dominant formulation in Europe, much of Europe, and certainly in the United States. So I'm just trying to see if we can configure that liberal populism idea in a slightly different way.